Standing in Times Square can be overwhelming. Everyone's rushing somewhere. Tourists are looking for the perfect photo. Taxis are creeping across intersections. And locals are trying to get to work, often by dodging those taxis. It's impossible to avoid other people. You're going to interact with someone somehow. The strange thing is that, in a way, it all works. No one's dictating exactly what each person should be doing. There are a broad set of rules New Yorkers understand in order to get through their days. But within those broad rules, people are free to pursue their own goals. So how does this all work together with so little direction? The answer is pretty interesting and pretty important. In fact, I want to show you how thinking more deeply about how cities and other systems work reveals new paths for behavioral science and policy in general. To do this, I'm going to take you on a journey through New York City. Our guide will be a major new study from BIT on how behavioral science should be used in the future. Let's go exploring and see what we find and why it matters. Welcome to this episode of Inside the Nudge Unit. My name is Michael Halsworth, and I'm the Managing Director of the Behavioural Insights team in the Americas. I work from our New York City office, but as I'm sure you've guessed, I'm not a born and bred New Yorker. I have, though, been fortunate to live and work in this amazing city for many years now. Before we return to the chilly concrete canyons of Manhattan, it would probably be helpful for me to step back and explain why I'm talking to you now. For the last decade or more, the Behavioural Insights team has been using behavioural science to help address challenges all around the world. Our projects have ranged from reducing antibiotic resistance to increasing social cohesion. This work is vitally important, and we're really proud of what we've achieved. But we also find ourselves with a nagging sense that behavioural science could do even more. But how? Over the last few years, we spent time developing what we're calling a new manifesto for the future of behavioural science. The manifesto builds on the work BIT and others have been doing for many years now. And this podcast marks the launch of this ambitious agenda and a set of actions to help improve people's lives. Right now, I'm going to explore one central concept in the manifesto. For behavioural science to step up and play its full part, it needs to be combined with our latest understanding of how different systems actually work. It's tempting to see this city as a system. But we're not talking about a system like an engine where you can label every part and map how each of them connects to the others. Instead, as in Times Square, the city system is made up of countless different actors making decisions, reacting to what others are doing, and adjusting to the environment they find themselves in. There's a name for this kind of setup, a complex adaptive system. Now that idea may sound, complex, but I think that it is key to meeting some of the major challenges our societies face. While it's impressive how these systems almost seem to run themselves, the truth is they can also be vulnerable. Small changes can cascade rapidly into big consequences in ways that are hard to anticipate. Think how one vehicle breaking down in the middle of a major intersection can cause traffic to quickly back up in all directions for miles. In order to succeed, complex adaptive systems need to adapt to a growing range of challenges. An unexpected breakdown causing gridlock can be intensely irritating and incur real-world costs and consequences. But there are other events that can cause much more serious damage to people and property. Like flooding, for example, something that New York is growing ever more vulnerable to. In 2012, Superstorm Sandy killed 43 people, destroyed thousands of homes, and caused around $20 billion of damage. It was a similar story in 2021 when Hurricane Ida turned some subway lines into rivers and killed at least 13 people.
More than 7 inches of rain in just a few hours. The Western Hemisphere's busiest subway system shut down. Waterfalls pouring down station stairs, trains pulling in to find platforms submerged.
When we think of flood defences, we tend to think of walls and barriers, objects to stop the water from flowing in. But I think we'd be better off looking at the tools that the Netherlands uses, since half their population lives below sea level. Instead of fortifying cities with barrier walls, they've started to rebuild salt marshes along coastal regions. These natural defence systems absorb waves and can limit the risks of sea level rise. They can also grow and adapt to new flooding challenges. And as it turns out, New York City has a similar kind of natural solution as well, or at least it used to. Oysters used to fill New York Harbour. In fact, half of the world's oysters may have once called these waters home. Much like apartment dwellers, living oysters pile on top of each other. They form reefs, and these reefs used to make up more than 200,000 acres of the city's coastline, acting as natural flood defenses. But, as you'll know, people also like to eat oysters. And by the start of the 20th century, more than 1 billion of them were being harvested each year. Overfishing and pollution led to a rapid decline, and the last oyster beds closed in the 1920s. We know from sediment analysis that storm surges began to make their way further onshore from then onwards. I'm here on Governor's Island at the headquarters of the Billion Oyster Project with Pete Malowski, who's the head of the project. So Pete, could you explain what the Billion Oyster Project is and what it does?
Yeah, we're a small nonprofit located on Governor's Island right in the center of New York City. And our mission is to restore oyster reefs to New York Harbor through public education initiatives. So essentially, we're trying to restore the lost landscape to New York City's biggest and best looking open space, and to do that in a way that involves as many different people as possible. We work a lot with public school students, but the idea is to build a cleaner, more abundant New York Harbor that is well loved and well cared for by all New Yorkers. And we believe that the act of restoring the natural environment is the most powerful way to build awareness and affinity for the natural world.
Can you tell me a bit more about the reefs that you build? What are they? How do they work? Do they grow?
All of our reef sites are research projects, so we're trying to learn how best to restore oysters to New York Harbor, and so they have varying levels of success. We learn different things from different installations, but for the most part, what we're doing is we're building reef structures that simulate a mature oyster reef, and the structures are about the size of a coffee table. They weigh 400 pounds. They're made of steel filled with restaurant shell and live oysters. So we actually we get oyster larvae, which are free swimming, to attach to those shells and then install them at various sites around the harbor. And it's at some of the sites, they grow really well and the oysters reproduce, and that's fantastic. At some of the sites, they'll all be covered in mud or all the oysters will be eaten. But slowly over the last 10 years, we've learned where is best to restore oyster reefs, what structures are work the best long term, and where there are natural oyster populations that we can kind of leverage to help build a sustainable oyster population throughout the harbor.
And can you tell me a bit more about the link to flooding and flood defenses?
If you look back in time, when New York Harbor was full of oyster reefs, it had a dramatic impact on storms and waves on the shoreline. And you can look at the sediment record in a place like Staten Island, and you can see signals from every major storm event, because the major storm event takes sediment from the bottom of the harbor and pushes it up onto land. So you can see those signals in the sediment. But once you get back to 500 years ago or 400 years ago, that signal stops. So that's sort of very strong evidence that the presence of mature oyster reefs limit the impact of storm waves on the land.
And your work, will that potentially help with some of the flooding risks in the future? How would it do that?
Oyster reefs can be part of an integrated solution to the risk created by climate change and rising water levels, more intense storms. Oyster reefs on their own are not going to keep the water out of New York City, but combined with other interventions, they can have a really powerful impact. Specifically because oyster reefs will continue to grow with rising water levels. It's a hard wave-breaking structure that can both break waves in the short term, but also as sea level rise continues, those reef structures will grow with the rising water levels. So in certain places throughout the harbor where there is there are many places around the harbor where oyster reefs can have a powerful impact in protecting the shore.
So it can also be an adaptive solution rather than a seawall which is static.
Absolutely. And looking at the 500 plus miles of shoreline in New York City, one, it's impossible to keep the water out. There's no way to build a seawall that's going to completely prevent any water from ever getting into New York City. And so I think having a variety of solutions makes sense. And there's also a lot to be said for the social resiliency that's built from a community that understands the harbor, is integrated within the harbor, and understands tides and currents and waves and storms and that kind of thing. So walling off the harbor is a way to prevent that social resiliency from building. And you also create a binary solution where you're either protected or you're not. And so it's sort of a false sense of security. And then if one of those walls is overtopped, you have a community has no connection with the resource that is, all of a sudden inundated. And that is sort of what we saw during Hurricane Sandy.
And Hurricane Sandy, that led to some changes. And then you're also kind of changing behavior, human behavior here. Can you say a bit more about how people may engage with a particular activity and it has wider consequences or wider changes to what they think and do?
It's certainly what we believe. And there's a million anecdotes from our last 10 or 15 years of work that speak to that. Getting down into New York Harbor and pulling up an oyster cage that's filled with animals and seeing shrimp and seahorses and fish jump out of the cage has a profound impact on anybody, and particularly someone who's never thought of there being animals in New York Harbor before. Mm-hmm. And you can't take that back.
The key thing here is that this approach is adaptive. Unlike a seawall that needs to be repaired, raised, or rebuilt, these oyster beds respond themselves to changes. Adaptation is built in. They show us that when you're dealing with a complex system like a harbour or a city, policymakers need to be careful about just trying to solve the problem in front of them, like building an immovable seawall based on the floods you faced in the past. For enduring results, solutions need to be adaptive and be integrated as part of the system itself. That's particularly true because you may not be able to predict many of the consequences of any change you make. Now, these unforeseen effects can be good. For example, Pete says that the biggest value of the Oyster Project could be the way that it helps people understand how floods can be mitigated and gets them involved with making it happen, leading to broader changes in behavior.
It's easy to look at the goofy flood walls under the FDR Drive and think that that's not going to solve the problem. But if you're the one filling the sandbags, then you're connected to it. You're participating in making the world better. The key to solving these challenges, the challenges of climate change, is changing human behavior. And humans aren't going to change their behavior without a direct connection to the natural world.
But maybe we should be most concerned about the bad unintended effects that can emerge when we make a change in a dynamic system. Let's look at one.
Register sick.
Can I get back with that? Many states in the US have introduced bans on plastic carry-out bags. The one in New York came into force in 2020. Sounds simple enough, right? If businesses aren't allowed to use plastic bags, then there'll be less plastic waste. Not exactly. Let's hear from Dr. Rebecca Taylor from the University of Sydney.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Taylor. I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Economics at the University of Sydney.
And you carried out a really interesting study on plastic bags. Can you just tell us, what did you find?
So I studied California's plastic bag ban, which was a ban on thin plastic carryout bags at supermarkets in different cities and counties across California. And what I found was that these policies had their intended effect in reducing the amount of thin carryout bags used. I found that in total, aggregating across the state, the policy led to a 40 million pound reduction in the amount of plastic carryout bags being used. However, I also found this unintended consequence, which was that sales of garbage bags increased substantially. In fact, sales of 4-gallon garbage bags increased by 120%. And because garbage bags are actually made of a thicker plastic, I find that the sales, aggregating all of the garbage bag sales that happened, that led to a 12 million pound increase in the amount of plastic that was being used because of the ban. So when you take these two things together, about 30% of the plastic that was eliminated by using fewer carryout bags came back in the form of people buying more garbage bags. And I should note that that's because people were reusing their carryout bags as garbage bags before the policy. The policy meant that people could no longer reuse these bags. They didn't have them around, and so they had to start purchasing them.
And that's fascinating. And you only found that out because you studied more than just the intended outcome. You looked at the system as a whole. Is that right?
That's right. Thinking about not just what the purpose of the goal was to affect what people were doing in the store, but also thinking about what happens outside of the store. What do people do with their bags once they bring them home? We are worried about the bags that do become litter, but not all bags, end up, in oceans and waterways. And so what was happening to those other bags? From my own personal experience, I knew that some of these bags were being reused. And so I wanted to see if I could actually find this in the data. And it turns out, using data from supermarkets on sales of garbage bags, we do see a substantial number of people were doing this really green behavior of reusing their grocery bag as a garbage bag. And so, what's interesting is we find that this effect, is even stronger for people who have pets, for people who have young children. There's definitely a need for garbage bags that the carryout bags provided. And so that's something that, it wasn't what you do at the grocery store doesn't happen in isolation. These decisions are connected.
And do you think it's possible to anticipate this stuff when you're making a policy? What would a better policy process or a better policy look like in this space? Or is that just how things are? Is it just you have different policies, they have different goals, and we have to trade off?
Yeah, I think the policy tool and how flexible it is important in terms of, trying to think about unintended consequences. Part of the reason they're called unintended is because it's hard to actually foresee all of them. With a ban, it's a very blunt policy tool. We're banning a particular type of, in this case, bag. What happened is it created a whack-a-mole situation where one type of bag was banned, but then people started using other types of bags that had their own environmental problems. I didn't even get to the results around paper bags. Paper bags also increased, and they have their own environmental issues. And so then policymakers had to regulate paper bags. And, maybe they need to think about regulating other types of, reusable bags or thicker plastic bags that people start using. And so part of the issue is the policy tool. If it's really blunt, it doesn't have necessarily that flexibility. Other policy tools that might be useful instead, something that I find in my research is that a bag tax has similar effects on reducing the amount of carryout bags that are used, but don't necessarily have all these unintended consequences on causing growth of other types of bag usage. And so there's a policy tool choice that the tax is a little bit more flexible. On the other hand, it can be a little bit politically challenging to implement a tax. And so that's one of the reasons we've seen bans over taxes in the US. Economists like to think about all the different unintended consequences that could happen. It's you can sort of hypothesize, but it's often hard to know exactly how people are going to respond until the policy goes into effect. And that's why having some flexibility in your policy tool is important.
Just over the Hudson River, New Jersey went even further than New York and banned paper bags in large supermarkets. The idea was that people would bring their own reusable bags instead. However, in the 2 years since the law was introduced, many more people now shop online. The result, according to the New York Times, is that now many people have hundreds of reusable bags that have come with their weekly shopping deliveries. These outcomes may seem obvious in retrospect, and perhaps they could have been anticipated. But it can be hard to account for all the potential outcomes in a complex system. Another reason why policy solutions and rules need to have adaptability built in. Liz Costa, the managing director of BIT in the UK, has thought a lot about how to build this kind of adaptability into regulation and other policies.
So, as we know, markets are dynamic systems, and so regulators need to think about intervening in particular parts of markets, but also thinking about second round and long-term effects. A great example of this is an experiment that was run on TikTok in 2021. And what the researchers did is they tested the impact of flagging and downranking unsubstantiated claims on TikTok. So things like avocados causing COVID. And they were looking at the impact of this on sharing and spreading misinformation on the platform. And what they saw was that these flags and downranks reduced shares on the platform by about 24%, likes by 7%, and views by 5%, which is super interesting and really valuable to know. But obviously, the different actors in the system are going to react to that. So content creators are going to adapt their content to try and dodge these flags and downrankings. And equally, the users of the platform are going to get used to those, and the effect of them might wear off over time. So the regulators need to be thinking about not just intervening at a point in time, but also thinking about those long-run effects and how to design a system that adapts.
What's an example of a unresilient or brittle policy, the kind we want to avoid?
It's really important that we look at the ecosystem in which a behaviour is occurring and also the long-run implications. One of my favourite examples is a series of studies run by the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK. And they were looking at how to encourage people to repay credit card debts. And they're particularly worried about people only repaying the minimum amount, because that means that people are in debt for longer and also that they pay more interest. So they did some really promising lab studies where removing the minimum repayment anchor increased the value of credit card repayments, and quite significantly so. So then they then followed this up with a series of randomised control trials with real credit card customers. And what they saw was actually a lot more complicated. So the direct debit payments did increase when you took away the minimum repayment anchor, but they also saw a reduction in ad hoc repayments on the card. So the total effect was that there was no impact on credit card debt from removing that minimum repayment anchor, even though it was a really intuitive and appealing and well-evidenced idea up to that point. So it's just a great reminder that we need to be looking at stick evaluations and thinking about long-run implications, displacement effects, and really focusing on what is the outcome we're trying to achieve in the long run.
Understanding these complex adaptive systems is a crucial part of tackling big policy issues, whether in terms of finding an adaptive solution, like the oysters, or anticipating the wider effects of a change, like the bag tax. What's exciting is the role behavioural science can play here. To date, behavioural science has often focused on how individuals in isolation respond to a set of choices. Think of how the bag tax example was focused mainly on how individual consumers would respond, not the wider system of grocery deliveries. Instead, we can bring together behavioural science and insights from complex systems in order to tackle the big issues better. A good starting point is to take another look at a phrase that is often associated with nudges, that small changes can have a big impact. How better to do this than to ask my boss, David Halpern, who literally wrote a book with a subheading, How Small Changes Can Make a Big Difference.
Yeah, so we've always got an eye when we're making some kind of change. Not only how does it affect the individual behaviour, but also how does it, spill over. So we did that in the UK with respect to sugar in drinks, where we have a particular kind of sugar levy, as it's known, which makes drinks slightly more expensive. Now, that does affect the individual behaviour. At least some people, a lot of people don't notice, but some people choose a slightly different drink. But in this case, the question is, how does it play over? What does it do, as it were, to the overall, equilibrium, or Michael, you call them leverage points in the manifesto? So what we see is that it means that the stores don't want to hold drinks that aren't selling quite so well, so they'll switch to other drinks. And that in turn affects manufacturers who want to make sure their drinks are on the shelves. So even though there's a relatively modest change at the individual level, it has this knock-on consequence, in this case, that drives reformulation. We sometimes call it a double nudge. We nudge the individual a little bit, and then as they change their behavior, they nudge others in the system, in this case, food manufacturers. And the beauty of it is that it has a kind of loop, which means that even for those people who couldn't really quite be bothered, the drinks they're drinking are in fact having less sugar in them, are becoming healthier as a so you're getting this change in equilibrium. This leverage is not only affecting the individual level, it's changing the sort of average level. It's changing the whole system. And that's really a big deal. I mean, the key nudges in the world are often not governments, or it's people to each other, how we affect each other's behavior, and how does it domino through the consequences, of the population? Do people react against it, or do they actually, does it amplify in some way? And another example in the green behavior space is that we made changes around, if you buy an electric vehicle, actually, it's not a matter of law or anything, but by default, your number plate, your registration plate, has on it a green tag. Actually, you can say if you don't want it, you don't have to have it. It's just there. But what it does is it makes it much more visible, electric vehicles. And we know this kind of behavior is literally sort of contagious. When you see other people driving electric vehicles, you're more likely to buy them. In the same way that solar panels on roofs also are kind of contagious. You see them, and as they kind of become a bit more, visible in areas, other neighbours essentially adopt solar panels too. So those are examples where you make what is initially a small change, but it amplifies. That isn't always the case, but behavioural scientists should be especially interested in understanding that. When do the dominoes go down? That's not just a one-off that decays away, but in some way amplifies and finds its way to a new equilibrium.
But there's another role that behavioural science can play, and that's by helping inform and design the rules of the system itself. A well-functioning city grows and develops. Its residents and visitors, through their actions and interactions, create new possibilities and opportunities. Throughout history, great cities have sparked advances in art, technology, and philosophy that have benefited the whole world. These outcomes are, of course, impressive, but the reality is, on a day-to-day basis, people in cities are just getting on with their lives. And to do this, they rely on a core set of relatively simple rules to guide their behaviour.
Hi, why are you in Times Square today? Excuse me, what are you up to today?
Here, when trying to get someone to talk to me, I'm using the simple rule of don't approach anyone who's walking very quickly. While most people are using the principle of never talk to someone who approaches you in Times Square. Behavioural scientists have studied how people use these simple rules as mental shortcuts or heuristics to make decisions. The big task for the future is to understand how these mental shortcuts interact with the rules of the system that policymakers or others set. Because even a small change to those system rules could have a bigger effect. To show what I mean, think about some rules that are familiar to most of us wherever we live. That's the rules for crossing the street. In 2021, Transport for London experimented with a new way for people to cross the road. Red lights, meaning don't cross, are often the default for pedestrians at crossings in London. People have to push a button and wait for the green signal to go ahead. Then, authorities changed the rules at 18 crossings so the lights were on green by default. Pedestrians didn't have to stop and press a button. They'd see the green light and be able to cross right away, unless an oncoming vehicle was detected, at which point the signal would turn red automatically. The results show that the changes reduced walking times for people by about 1.3 hours a day for each crossing. Pedestrians also started complying more with the signals when they were on red, and the changes had virtually no effect on journey times for vehicles. So this was both a classic nudge, changing the default, and an example of changing one part of a system to have wider effects. Because the signals gave pedestrians information that went along with their goals, be it to get to school or make it home, people started respecting them more. If walking is both safer and more attractive, people may start walking more. If people walk more, it creates wider systemic effects on transport demand, congestion, and pollution, all from changing the default from red to green. When addressing challenges, we need to place the desired behaviour within the context of the wider system. We need to build solutions that are resilient to the way systems change, like the oyster beds. We need to be aware of how systems can produce unintended effects, like the plastic bag tax. We need to identify ways that smaller changes in behaviour can create system-wide effects. And we should see how targeted changes to the rules of the game can have wider impact, like the pedestrian crossing changes. The key thing is to understand what kind of system you're dealing with. In simpler systems, more direct approaches work better, but some systems are so complex they just can't be controlled directly or predictably. That's where the idea of systems stewardship comes into play. The best option may be to create the conditions for behaviours to emerge, rather than trying to drive specific outcomes in specific places. And this perspective also means we need to shift away from considering policies in isolation and instead try to manage their cumulative effects. We already have many examples of how we can do this in practice. Mayors of large cities know that the best way is to set the rules of the game, let people use their own resources to pursue goals, and adjust the rules when needed. As the threat of flooding shows, getting this right is not a nice to have, but rather an existential challenge. And there will be many other issues where behavioural science will be the key to securing the systems on which we all depend.
The full manifesto for applying behavioral science is available now for free on our website at www.bi.team. This episode was recorded in and around New York City by Sabina Singhani. Our thanks to Pete Malinowski of the Billion Oyster Project and Rebecca Taylor of the University of Sydney for kindly agreeing to be interviewed. Editing and sound design was by Andy Hetherington of Studio Gibbon, and the producer was Rich O'Brien. Inside the Nudge Unit is a production of the Behavioral Insights team. Thanks as always for listening, and we hope you'll join us again next time.